Good day, folks. This is a presentation on Salesforce flows. Today we're going to talk a bit about how to solution very quickly with Salesforce flows, when and when not to use these, and some key elements that these include. This is a presentation I gave to the Charleston, South Carolina Administrators Group back on February 6th, and recording it now for everybody's benefit here on the web. All right, so to go ahead and get started, let's take a quick look at some other resources you can find in addition to this. Make yourself at home in the Trailblazer community if you haven't already. You can connect with folks there locally who use Salesforce, who administer Salesforce, develop with Salesforce. You can also gain access to a lot of great materials through Trailhead, amongst many other resources in learning Salesforce. So certainly encourage you to take a look at the Trailblazer community, dive in deep, and learn a bit more. All right, just a quick introduction on me and the Coterie and who we are. My name is Josh LeQuire. I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina. I am a Tar Heel. I love to smoke meats. If you ever want to talk barbecue, you ever want to talk pork butts, ribs, brisket, give me a call. I'm also a karate geek. I'm a very proud husband and father as well. The Coterie is a company dedicated to systems implementation and product development work for folks who want to publish apps on the App Exchange or just want to implement Salesforce and build it out to meet their needs. Right now, we are focusing in on healthcare and life sciences. We do help businesses of all flavors, all industries, all styles, and backgrounds, and so forth. But healthcare is where we really focus and dig in. If you ever need any help with anything, feel free to give us a call. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to look at today. So I want to cover some very important principles and foundations in terms of how you build apps, how you implement Salesforce that apply to flows. Before we get into it, I want to talk a bit about what a flow is, some of the key elements that you need to interact with there, and how to use these tools. I want to talk a little bit about when and when not to use a flow, what works well, what doesn't work well. Flows are great on their own, but they're also even better when you integrate things like Apex and Lightning components with them, and they're even better when you know how to use all the tools together and when and how appropriately to apply these. I want to talk a little bit about creating service contracts from opportunities. This is a very simple use case that lends itself well, at least as we have outlined here, to using just a flow exclusively. And also talk about something a little bit more robust where we introduce entitlements as part of service contracts and even creating assets with entitlements that would lend itself more to using Apex and or Apex with a flow. That would make a lot more sense just due to the complexity and number of objects and scope. All right, so let's talk about some best practices in terms of how we build applications in Salesforce before we even dive into a flow. So first things first, before you sit down and do anything in Salesforce, if you're not doing this already, really take a deep dive into what your users are asking for, what you think your business process needs really are. This can take form in building user stories. This can take form in building a product backlog. This can take form in doing some flow charts, process diagrams, entity or relationship type diagrams. If you feel comfortable using these tools, you certainly understand the approach and the process. If this is something that is new and familiar to you, I certainly suggest that you look up some courses through Trailhead and through other resources on business analysis and solution design. It's always good to do that level of thinking in terms of what steps need to occur in what order, what handoffs need to take place, what validations need to take place, what other types of updates need to take place before you even go into a sandbox, developer org, or production. And of course, always do your work first in the sandbox, always do your work in a developer org, especially if you're learning and training. Trailhead, of course, provides a lot of these great resources as well, but make sure that you're using the right tools for the right job in terms of exploration and doing some initial development. But here are just some good things to think about as you build a flow, as you build any application really, or any type of functionality in Salesforce in a modular type manner. What kind of data do you need? What comes into the process? What kind of processing work are you doing? What goes out of the process? So if you think of inputs, process, and outputs, that's a great framework to use to start. What kind of experience needs to take place? Do your users need to have something a little bit more intuitive, something easier to access, something that needs to go across many objects or perhaps many different types of complex or simple validations and so forth involved? And what other alternatives exist? You know, they say to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, let's make sure we're using the right tool for the right job. And on that topic, let's take a look at what tools are available to you. So flows are great for certain applications. We'll dive a lot deeper into that, but you may find that you have other needs as well. So as you're looking at things like how you present the experience to the user, is it more appropriate to use a very flexible Lightning record page with different types of layouts for different types of profile assignments? Or does it make more sense to use something like a Lightning component, whether that's Lightning Web Components or Aura, or does it make sense to use Visualforce? Is there a bit more complex experience where the user needs to stay on a single page and do certain specific things before he or she goes to the next page? As we look at logic and data manipulation, we have a lot of great tools, as you're well aware, out of the box, between validations, between workflows, between processes, between flows. But in a lot of cases, those may not make the most sense. You may want to look to using some form of Apex controllers, triggers, async type jobs, or async type operations, or you might find something else that could be a little more helpful for a given use case. Security is something we always need to think about in every scenario. Whether we make a flow accessible to a user to launch, whether we want to make sure that sharing is respected and permissions are checked as part of even a flow or any other type of process. These are important things to consider because in many cases, a lot of you folks out there have a lot of sensitive data you don't want everybody having access to, so we just only want to give access to folks that need access to what they're looking at. You can do this through a myriad of declarative sharing rules and profiles and permissions, or even programmatic sharing if that's a tool you want to use to expose or not expose something to a user. So let's talk a little bit about the world of declarative and programmatic. Just real quick, as you see highlighted here in blue, these are elements of what's called the Lightning framework. So approval processes, flow, and process builder work together. There's a common misperception out there that it's clicks, not code, or clicks over code. When you're using Salesforce, you need to determine when it's appropriate to use clicks and when it's appropriate to use code. It's not necessarily a juxtaposition or an argument of one over the other. It's what makes the most sense for a given job. For a declarative tool like a flow, for example, it's very quick, easy to implement. If you want to prototype a solution, you want to get some feedback, you want to try something out, go with that tool. If you need just sort of a short fix, you want to try a process builder, you want to try a workflow, all those things certainly make a ton of sense. These are great for individual one-off transactions, small volumes of data. These tools work very well. It's only really as you start getting into larger volumes of data where you need to process many records at once, where you might need the user to do some more complex type things across one record or many records that you just can't do with a layout, with a page, or other types of validations and workflow. And certainly when you need to look at bulk transactions. And what that really means is, if you're running data loads or if you have large data transactions occurring in your database outside of the user interface, whether it's through integrations, whether it's through jobs that you run to keep data clean, up to date, and linked together, you're going to find that Apex is going to make a lot more sense. One thing we see often is a lot of folks out there love to put many process builders, many workflows, and even many triggers on a single object. And over time, as those things clash with each other, you find performance issues where you're having to lower your data loads down to a batch size of 1, or you're having to find other types of workarounds to get reports generated to just do simple things inside of Salesforce. This is a great opportunity and certainly a separate topic for a more advanced forum to really take a look at what you have loaded on your objects and how these things interact with each other. But again, programmatic is going to work well for scale, going to work well for custom experience. Declarative is going to work a bit better, specifically when we talk about flows, when things are a little bit simpler, you have more one-off, one-by-one use case type needs. Let's talk a little bit about what a flow is. So if you haven't been exposed to a flow before, and this is your first time looking at it, I would certainly encourage you to go to Trailhead. Here we have some links in the slides, and I'll share these out with the presentation as well. On trail mixes you can look at. There's one I constructed for you that you can follow. There's another pretty good one too that Trailhead and Salesforce have put together. Either way, dive in. A flow is really a visual representation of automation. You can do a lot of things in a flow. You can do through an Apex trigger. You can do a lot of things in a flow. You can do through more complex types of interfaces than you would just out of the box with a layout, a page, or other types of similar functions. As you can see here, there's a few key elements that you need to learn. Screens, if you want the user to click a button and launch something, or you want the user to go through a series of prompts or a component that you have on a Lightning page, a screen-based flow is what you would use. If you don't want to use a screen-based flow, you can have it auto-launched from a process, from other types of automation as well. There are things kind of similar and analogous to a workflow rule where you can configure a process to fire based upon certain criteria that changes in the data, and it kicks off a flow, and the flow operates in the background. User never sees the screen. That's certainly a plausible and commonly used approach in implementing a flow. And then there's logic. So as you look through how things are decided, there are these little things called decisions that actually allow you to sort of route based upon logic that you have from a user, and their inputs are based upon logic from data you have on a record. You can route a record in different directions. Logic is a great way to, or I'm sorry, decisions are a great way to route people through different types of nodes and how you want them to interact with the flow or how you want data to be transformed. And then, of course, loops, which are a major part of flows. And this is where you, quote unquote, bulkify flows and make it easier to do things in larger volumes and also make it easier to do things that are a little bit more complex and create multiple sets of records. But logic's arguably where you'll spend most of your time working with variables, working with variable assignments. And then, of course, data, which is going to be, as you can see here, in terms of actions. Data is going to be where you actually manipulate something in the database. So whether you're calling another action or whether you're calling another flow or whether you're calling something directly to the database in terms of creating, updating, getting, or deleting records. Data, of course, is where you actually take all that manipulation and transformation you've done inside a flow and apply that to the database so that data is stored and persisted. Flows elements here, as you can see with the dotted line, or I'm sorry, the straight lines and so forth are connected through these things called connectors. And we'll get a bit deeper into variables because variables are really your building blocks of a flow. And this is where you'll arguably spend most of your time trying to plot out how things are transformed and how changes are applied to your database. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some good tips and practices when you use flows. Because flows work a lot like other elements in Salesforce, specifically work very close and look and feel a lot like how you would build something like a trigger inside of Apex. You want to apply very similar practices and flows that you would apply if you're writing something more programmatic in nature. So bulkify, what this means is as you work inside of flows, put things into lists. As you're calling the database, as you're making changes to the database, make these changes on a lot of records at once, not just one record. And we'll talk a bit more about this as we get into the example that I have illustrated for you here. Make sure you use your variables, your assignments and loops heavily. This gives you the opportunity to do a lot of transformation work, a lot of manipulation work without making a call to the database. Salesforce, as you're very familiar, is a multi-tenant platform with governors and limits. The minimal amount of database calls you put into your flow, the better. And this will just help you build something that scales and lasts. Make sure you're aware of these object cascading effects. We talked about this for a minute before. As you look at specifically big objects, standard objects like the account object, the contact object, opportunity object, lead object, typically these are loaded up with validation rules, loaded up with workflows and triggers, and loaded up with processes. As you're building these things, just do a good job of making sure everything is consolidated as best as possible. You don't have conflicting logic. Very easy to build a flow or a process and cause things to break and fail. Get creative with debugging. So flows are notorious for not being the best in terms of debugging and telling you when something didn't happen. I'll show you an example of this here in a little bit as we look at an error that's triggered from one of the flows that I've constructed for the purpose of this demo, and I'll purposely make it fail so you can see it. Sometimes the emails you get from Salesforce with details on what happened and why the error occurred are helpful, and sometimes they're not. For example, flows do not handle null pointer exceptions very well. So if you're processing a null record and you don't have logic in your flow to handle something that's null, which normally you could handle pretty well with Apex and other types of tools, you'll see the flow fail, and typically the error messaging is not super clear on why. Make sure you test these things thoroughly, just like you would anything else you put in production. You don't want to put a flow out there you're not 100% sure will work in every scenario. So think about the positive cases, the negative cases, the edge cases. How are people going to hit this thing, and what could they do to break it? Just as you would with any app or any component or anything you release into production. Flows are great to integrate with other platform tools, as you see here, Lightning Pages, making flows headless through Process Builder. Actions, you can integrate chatter actions and global actions and so forth well into flows and object-specific actions. This is a really neat integration as well. And we'll talk a little bit about Lightning Flow Scheduler. This is a relatively new feature. Admittedly, it's not one I've looked into heavily myself, but you can actually schedule flows to run at specific times. This is great. It mirrors the capability of something like a scheduled job inside of Apex. But more importantly, what we'll see, especially later as we get into more of the complex use cases where a flow alone does not work, we'll need to think about how we can invoke Apex, how we can embed Lightning components to really get the most out of these flows and make sure your users are able to do what you want them to do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we get to a solution. And really the core of this is not just what a flow is and all these cool pieces that are a part of a flow, but how do we get to a point to where we can actually use this thing for a solution we need to apply to our business need or other given need or scenario. So we always want to begin with the end in mind. What are we ultimately trying to create? So as we see in the use case here in a minute, we have a sale that's closed. We want to create a service contract with the same line items from the sale. At the end, we want to have a contract and line items. So how do we get there? Well, when we kick off a flow in that certain specific scenario, we have a sales opportunity that closes. It has products on it, and we want to pick those up and create a contract with its own product line or contract line items to create. So as we do this, we'll get out a pen and paper, we'll get out a Lucidchart or whatever tool you prefer to use to really kind of diagram the steps of a flow. I'm a huge fan of Lucidchart myself. It's a tool I use very regularly to really kind of draw things out and visualize it. This is also a great conversation tool as you're working with your business stakeholders to visualize things that need to happen in a manner that's intuitive and easy to understand and talk through with folks who are not technical. Then we'll go through the process of building, testing, and deploying. So just a little gotcha here as you're working across sandboxes and environments. You always want to make sure things work across environments as you promote up from one sandbox to another. As you promote from sandbox to production, you're always testing, making sure these things work. This will really bite you if you follow a practice of using hard-coded IDs for things like record types or other types of records. We want to make flows as dynamic as possible so we can put them in any environment that will work without having to hard code things into them. All right, so let's talk about a simple use case where we may want to implement a flow and how we can go about doing this. So in this given scenario, we have a company that focuses on holistic health. We'll call it TCIO. They sell a product or a piece of hardware called a home health tablet, an iPad, that comes pre-configured, pre-wired, and ready to go to use their applications. And then they sell subscriptions and service. So they have these home health application subscriptions. These are software as a service type things that actually help you to go in and manage your wellness, manage your nutrition, and make sure you interact with their team appropriately through digital channels. You also have access to ongoing support, and you could even purchase 1 hour one-on-one coaching sessions supplementally to the subscription services you have if you want to have a little bit more person-to-person interaction. So as we understand what this company is, what it sells, what it provides, we're now in a situation to look at a scenario where we have a client manager, and once a sales contract closes, we need to create a service contract so we know what to honor for that customer and how best to serve that to that customer, and we have a record of this in our database. Every line item that is a product on the opportunity should go into the service contract. That's a key piece here and feature, so we'll take a look at that. So just to consider here, if we were to diagram this out in terms of objects in Salesforce, so now that we've considered where we need to be at the end with the service contract and line items, we need to begin with an account, opportunity, and opportunity products. We need to create a service contract, and in this case, we're actually going to create a relationship between the service contract and opportunity. We want to make sure that that service contract can always be found. If you were to pull out the opportunity, you need to reference that. And then, of course, we'll copy these service contract line items from opportunity products. We'll basically have a one-to-one copy. All right, so now that we have a model in place, let's take a look at the flow. We really, at the end of the day, have something that will ultimately look like this. I want to walk you through a couple of elements and show you how this works in action. So as we construct this flow, we need some opportunity as the basis to work off of here. So what we need to tell the flow is which opportunity am I looking at for this particular flow to take place. If we end up initiating or initializing the flow from a place that does not have an opportunity, we don't pass this in, we show the user a screen saying, hey, I don't have an opportunity ID. I'm not sure what to process here. And this is a good little fail-safe in case somebody kicks off the flow automatically and we don't have something unintended or inadvertent to happen. Because flows don't really start off easily in giving you all the opportunity data like you would get in a trigger before, trigger old, trigger new type context, you actually have to requery the database and get the specific fields that you need to basically take that data if you want to copy it over to a contract, start a contract, and so forth. So what we're going to do here in this get records element is we're actually going to call the database to get this opportunity detail. We're just going to get it for the single opportunity. We're going to get a couple of key elements we need later in the flow to construct the service contract. Here we have a screen for the users. We go to the next element to show for the user to tell us when this contract should start and end. It may not necessarily be that the contract starts on the opportunity close date. It may be that the contract starts a little bit later. We want to give the user some control here to tell us when this thing starts and ends, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute. Here we're actually going to start constructing in this assignment a contract that we want to set up. So behind the scenes, and what you're not seeing here inside the manager box, and I'll show you this in a minute, is a variable of an S object type to assign these contract values where we begin constructing this. And don't worry if this is not making sense quite yet. We'll go through this a little bit deeper here in just a minute. Then at this point, in this next element of the flow, we actually create the service contract. And once we create the service contract, we get an ID from the database for that service contract. Then we take a look at the opportunity. Does this thing have line items? If so, we're going to go ahead and get those line items. We're going to start creating contract line. We're going to loop through all these to create a contract line item for each of these opportunity line items. We're going to assign this to a collection, which is a set of records, and then we're going to create the contract line items if we have these. So let's go ahead and inside of Salesforce and take a quick look. All right, we're now inside the flow, and I'll walk you through what each of these pieces look like. So as we start the flow, and if I were to go back, for example, to the opportunity page, you'll notice here that we have just sort of your plain vanilla contact. We have a plain vanilla account. Just to show you what this could look like, I'm going to create an opportunity. We'll call this test flow opportunity. But basically what we want to do, and I'm just going to go ahead and put this in a prospecting stage. We'll give it a close date. We'll click save. What I really want to do is I don't want users to be able to see this flow until the opportunity is marked as closed won. So the way we can do that, and this is a really nice part of Lightning, is we can actually, as we configure this flow component on the page, we can configure it to show conditionally only when we have an actual opportunity in a closed stage. So I can say record close equals true. Here specifically, I want to select this flow. I want to make sure that we pass the opportunity record ID into the flow. You can see here when I check that box, it automatically populates for me. I want to click save. And if you haven't activated this already, of course, you'd want to activate it. I've activated this as the org-wide default. So I'll go back. And what you'll see here is when I'm looking at an opportunity, this component will only show when I actually go over here to close. We'll say it's closed won. Now I can conditionally render. And this is a great way to get Lightning pages to work well with flows and make sure you're giving users these prompts only when you want them to see them. So we'll take a step back here. I now have a flow that starts with an input from the opportunity. So really here I'm just checking, did we get an opportunity ID? I have a variable in here, I call input opportunity ID. This is where that component takes the opportunity ID and passes it into the flow. If I'm saying, what I'm saying here basically is if this thing is not null, meaning I have a value, we're going to have a condition branch here to proceed. So the beauty of decision elements inside of a flow is I can configure as many outcomes as possible. So here I'm just saying I have an opportunity ID, but I really could say, you know, opportunity is greater than 0. And I may want to go here and say, it doesn't matter what state it's in, maybe the opportunity amount. Let me just go find the amount field. And the way we find the amount field is by finding an opportunity object here. So I have one called opportunity object, for example. I might say amount is greater than 0, and so forth. So decision elements, we'll dive a little bit more into these a little bit later too, are fantastic. I'm not going to save this because 1, I haven't created this input opportunity. I'll show you how I would do that in a minute. And 2, this kind of logic doesn't really help. So the pro and the con here is you can engineer any kind of routes out of these decision nodes you want. And really, I'm not sure the exact limit off the top of my head, but you can engineer any number of potential outcomes. But again, keep these things simple. Don't overcomplicate it just so you don't get into trouble. I'm going to cancel that. I have an input opportunity. Now I'm going to go here and get records. What am I going to do? Well, I'm actually going to go to the database here. And one thing I would suggest as you construct any and everything in a flow, make sure that your labels and names are clear. Here I've got a very clear idea that I'm getting some opportunity detail. I've got a description that tells me what to do. It's just a fantastic practice. Should you get hit by a bus, you decide to change jobs, or somebody else needs to pick up the work behind you, you get promoted, all those good things. That other people can actually go into this flow and know what's happening. So leave good notes, make good labels, put good descriptions. So here I'm using this get records component. I'm going to the opportunity object. I am going to find the opportunity where the ID equals this input opportunity ID that I created, this variable, this input variable, so I can make sure I pick only that opportunity. This is a filter that you can actually set to meet all records. That's very dangerous. I would not suggest doing that unless you know exclusively and actively what you're doing there. I'd always make sure that you have good conditions that are met so you're not returning back a list from the database that you don't want or perhaps more than you need. You can elect to sort records if there's some processing logic that requires things to be sorted in a certain way, or if you're doing things in a certain manner where you want to have parents in order so you can create children very easily for each of those parents and so forth. That being said, you can also select the opportunity field to sort a variable. Now, this is also a double-edged sword. If you're not getting everything you need for later in the flow, you'll get errors that don't make a ton of sense. If you're getting everything you need in the flow, this will work fine. So make sure you go through field by field, click the Add Field button, go here and, oh, there we go, and make sure you select field by field which ones you want. So here, if I can even type ahead and find, for example, contact, fiscal, quarter created. I can type anything I want, or I can just click delete if I don't want it. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel here because I don't want to save those changes. All right, so next, now that I have this opportunity, I want to get some information from my user. So this is actually a screen element. Screen elements are really, really cool inside of flows. You can basically construct sort of in a wizard format because you're always going to have these navigation components. You're going to have buttons here that will say either back or next, pause or finish. We'll not get into great detail there on what you see, but you have the capability, for example, to have a previous and next button, a next or finish button. You have a pause button if for any reason a user wants to save progress on these things and leave. This is especially helpful for more complex flows where you're gathering many pieces of information across many screens, and it might take the user some time to construct these. Pausing a flow will allow the user to come back to that flow later and retrieve that information he or she has already put in there. But again, just like before, I've got a very clean, simple name. I've got a very clear, lucid description about what's happening here. I've got what's called a text template, which is really cool to get information. So inside of flows, you can use these things called text templates where you might have text you need to repeat or have dynamic text you need to render that you use in many elements. If I were to go here, for example, to text templates, get input text, you can see here, this just says, please provide some key information. So when I flip back to the flow, you'll see, please provide some key information. And when I go back to the screen element, you'll see that this is actually a text template that I inject in here. Text templates are a really great debugging tool. If you want to use a combination of text templates and formulas throughout your flow to visualize on a screen or to drop into an email to send to you as you're debugging and texting, we'll get into that a little bit later. I can show you some tips and tricks there, but these are great ways to really go through step by step in a flow, especially if your flow is a little bit more complex, to figure out what values you have for a variable at a given point in time when trying to debug things. You'll see here I have a couple of data inputs. As you construct inputs on a screen, just like you can in the UI, you have pretty much every data type available, even some special ones you don't really get as you're configuring options in Salesforce. For example, this address block. This is actually really cool because you can actually go in, won't be able to see it here, but you can actually use a lot of that same kind of standard functionality you use on the account or contact to get an address. You can use checks boxes, you can display images, you can use multi-select pick lists, radio buttons, toggles, and so forth. All kinds of stuff at your disposal here to get all kinds of information from users. Note that some of these, just like the address component we saw before, and this toggle is only available in Lightning. You can't use these in classic flows, and for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to assume that everybody's working in Lightning, so that's the first and last time I'll say that. So screen elements are great. It's a wonderful way to collect information from a user. As you show user things like pick lists, you can actually construct pick lists from anything, which is a really neat feature of a flow. So you can make a pick list out of records. You know, if you build a list of records, you want the user to select a specific record. You can build a pick list out of choices you input manually if you want the user to pick out of certain things that don't exist in the database, or you can have that pick list refer to a true pick list field and pick its values. Again, lots of options here, but the idea is we want to get some information from the user and we want it to be validated in a certain format. So here we're going to ask for a service start and finish date. So what does this look like? We go back to our test opportunity. We have our text template. Please provide some key information. We're defaulting the service start date to the close date of the opportunity. That's another cool thing here. So here you can see I've created a default value for this to say, hey, give me the close date from this input opportunity that I just got from the database. Use that as the default. So a nice thing there is it can help the user really without having to click and find this information. They can just start there. And if it's correct, great. If not, they can go in and fix it. And then we have a default contract end date. This is actually constructed from a formula. So you can use formulas inside of flows just like you can use inside of any other element in Salesforce where formulas are allowed. So if I go here to default end date, you'll see I've constructed a formula that says, hey, give me that close date plus 365. I'm basically saying this outputs the opportunity close date plus 365 days. So again, using good names, good descriptions here. This is probably intuitive from looking at the formula, but it never hurts just to make things crystal clear in your description boxes. All right, so as we go to the screen, we'll default our start date to the close date. As you can see here, we're defaulted at 2/24. We'll default our end date to 365 days later. You'll see here the default end date is February 23rd because we're in a leap year, and then the user can go through the rest of the screen. So after we get some inputs, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to say, we need to build something called a contract. And here I've created an object variable called an output contract. So let me show you what that looks like inside of our manager. And by the way, if you're ever trying to find anything in a flow, you can use this little search bar very quickly to find things. It's a type ahead type feature, which is super nice. So here I've created what's called a single record S-object variable or object variable. So right here, I have this thing I've called output contract. This is the service contract the flow will produce. This data type is a record. So the beauty of this is I can say, for example, if I wanted to go back here and construct a new variable, let's say we go to here, we're going to call this, demo variable just for the demo. We can actually designate this variable to be anything. So variables are arguably your best friend inside of a flow. It could be text, it can be a record. When I select a record, for example, as you saw here, I'm going to select the object this record belongs to. So any object in the database is accessible. You'll see a little bit later as we get into the more complex scenario that I can even do things like look at entitlements. Oh, come on. I can look at product entitlement templates, which are really cool, and that's something we can look at a little bit later. But if the object exists in the database, you can. So here we'll do, for example, entitlement. We can designate this either as single by leaving this unchecked or multiple. We'll talk a little bit here in a second about multiple records instead of collection, and we can also make it available for input or output. If I were to go back, for example, to this input opportunity ID, this is what I'm telling Salesforce I want to get from, let's see, I'll show you here in variable. This is what I'm telling Salesforce I want to get from the UI to tell me which opportunity to start the flow. So this is a text variable because it's an opportunity ID. It's not an opportunity object variable with an ID. This is very important. You can't kick off the flow with that. The UI specifically, where I showed you on the page where we made this component conditional and also told it what input to get, we had to do that with the text variable. But here you can make things available for input if you want to kick off a flow with certain values, inject it into it, or output if the flow needs to spit something out and put it somewhere else. All right, so next, after we assign all these values to this variable, so here I have this output contract, it's an object variable, I'm giving it the account ID from the opportunity, I'm giving it the service start date. This actually comes from, you can see here, a screen component. So if we were to go back to the flow and look at the user entering a service start date, a service end date, I can actually use what the user's input there and stamp that. So this will become the contract start date. Contract end date will become the service end date that we gathered in that screen from that user. And then, of course, there's some other things for the opportunity I need to construct the service contract. For example, a price book ID. Uh, I would like to go ahead and set the default contract status to inactive so somebody can actually go through, review it, and activate it a little bit later. This would be something that you would emerge either through gathering your business requirements or through iterative testing. I want to make sure that I have this lookup on the contract. I have a field here I created that's a lookup to the opportunity called originating opportunity. And so I can go to any service contract and I can see the opportunity that service contract came from. That's going to be the opportunity ID. And then, of course, I'm constructing a new contract name. This is a formula. And what that formula is essentially the opportunity name plus service contract. But a formula being a formula, you can make that anything. You can make that opportunity name plus service contract plus start date, or opportunity name plus service contract plus end date, and so forth. So a lot of flexibility there. After I assign these values, I'm actually going to go ahead and create that service contract. And this is super important because anytime I need to create children for a parent, I need an ID for that parent to create its children. Why? Well, what records do those children look up to? You need an ID for that. So we're actually going to make a call to the database. This is using the create record element. In the create record element, of course, I've specified my name and description. I'm going to create one record because really I've set up a single object variable, and that's all I really care to create. I'm going to create all the values from this variable I've constructed. So I have this single variable called output contract in the previous step through the assignments where I gave it values, right? I told it what account, I told it its name, I told it what price book to use and so forth, made all those assignments. I have the option here to use separate resources, separate values, and so forth if I want to construct this manually. Recommendation here, just for your own sanity, is just to use the S-object variables, use the assignments. It's a lot simpler. You could go down this route, but I'd recommend that you just stick with variables inside of a flow to keep things simple. I'm just going to cancel this since I've already constructed it. Now, I want to see if I need to construct line items for the service contract. So basically, what I'm going to do here is take a look at this opportunity. It has this wonderful field. It's a standard field that's checked by the system if it has line items, has opportunity line item. When this is true, I basically want to say, give me all those line items for that opportunity because these are things I want to clone and construct for the service contract. So I'll make a call to the database. You'll see here I've written good name and description. I'm looking at the opportunity products, looking where the products, opportunity products have an opportunity ID of this opportunity. I want to get all the records, and I'm going to do something kind of cool here. I'm actually, I could automatically store all fields, which is a great piece of functionality if you just want to get all the data, or I could say just give me certain variables and fields, and I'll take care of this here. And in this case, I've decided, well, I don't really need all the data from my opportunity products. I just really need these key fields. I want the price book entry. I want the product ID. I want the product family. This is one thing I'll talk about here in a minute. I actually constructed a formula on the opportunity product object to give me the product family so I could facilitate this flow. That's arguably, you could say, a downside of the flow. Sometimes you have to construct these types of formulas on objects that you would normally have to construct if you're using something like Apex, but we'll dig into that a little bit later. Now, of course, want to get the quantity, unit price, and total price. And here, this is a very small but important checkbox. If you don't get anything back, make sure you set these variables to null. This goes back to some of the null checking I mentioned for a minute before. But here, basically, I'm saying, give me, using this get records operation, all the opportunity products for this opportunity. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through all these records. So I created these opportunity products went into a record collection. So just like we looked at before, this is a record variable that allows me to store multiple values, which is also known as a collection. And what I'm going to say is, as I go through this collection, I want to evaluate each one of these items as what I'm calling here the opportunity line item or OLLI loop item. So what this is saying is, as I go through this collection, let's say I have 10 items, item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. These are going to be the item that the loop is looking at. So this loop will run, for example, in that example of 10 items, it'll run 10 times for, and each item that it looks at is designated as an OLLI loop item. So this is an instance, a scope of within this loop that, this one thing I want to look at for this given point in time. So for each of these, what I'm basically going to say is, I want to take each item here And basically, I want to construct a new contract line item because these contract line items don't exist. I have to build them. So what I'm doing is I'm actually creating a variable here inside this flow called final contract line item. So this is yet another variable, and this is where flows can be a little tricky. It takes a little bit of learning, and this is what the learning curve is. But I've basically got a new variable inside of this. It's a new single variable. It's called final contract line item. Final contract line item is a record type variable for this object of contract line item. So basically what I'm saying is inside this flow, take this Ollie loop item, so this item inside of this collection, and build me a new contract line item S object. So when I say build, this is something the computer is sort of, for lack of better words, doing in memory. It hasn't committed anything to the database. We're starting to build this thing that we need to put into the database. Go ahead and start building, this final contract service line item and assign these values, right? So for each of these pieces of the contract line item, the service contract ID, I want this contract ID for the contract I just created. For the product ID, I want this product ID from this loop item, and so forth. So you can see here, I'm assigning a price book entry ID from the loop item. I'm assigning a product ID from the loop item. I'm assigning quantity from the loop item, and a unit price. And you can see here that when I got records from the database, I got total price, but I'm not assigning it here. Good reason for that. Another reason why, flows can sometimes be helpful and not helpful in terms of error messaging. If I were to add total price into this, the flow would fail because that's a field that's calculated by the system, and it's not necessarily something we need to put on there in this flow. But the flow will allow you to do that, even though intuitively it probably shouldn't. So that's another drawback of a flow is, sometimes it allows you to do things you really shouldn't be doing, and you wouldn't really know until you run the flow and find the error. And in some cases, that error is not super clear. All right, so I'm going to construct this new line item, and then the last and arguably most important part of this loop is, now that I've constructed this line item, I want to add it to a new record variable collection. So basically what I'm saying is, I built this, I went in, I looked at this opportunity line item inside this loop. I built the service contract line item. Now I want to put it inside of something that I can use later to create these records. So back when we were talking about bulkifying a flow, doing things in mass and using large transactions, this is where that comes into play. We want to make sure that we're not going through this loop and calling the database, say, create record, create record. What we're going to do first is put that record inside of collection, and then we're going to make one call to the database to create, for example, those 10 contract line items instead of making 10 calls. This is really important, especially as you're working with large data volumes. You have limits you can hit very quickly inside of a flow, just like you would inside of Apex, in terms of the number of transactions you can have on the database, number of calls you can make to the database. So basically here, we're going to say, as part of this collection, and I'm going to go back here and find this. So you can see here, I have final contract line items. I'm adding this new contract line item singular to this collection of contract line items plural. See here how we have allowed multiple items. And once this loop finishes, I'm going to go to the database. I'm going to say, take all of these contract items I'm just constructed. So you can see here I'm creating multiple records. And I'm creating it from this collection I just created from that loop. So as you work inside of a flow, working inside of loops, understanding how these things work is arguably the most important concept to learn inside of a flow, because this is where you actually start building things across objects. You can see here, we started it with an opportunity, we started with line items, now we have a contract, now we have contract line items. This is where we construct things in bulk and do this creatively to limit our database calls. So let's take a look real quick at what this looks like. All right, now we're looking at this opportunity we saw before. Let's go ahead and construct the data in a manner to where we can actually test this flow with line items. So I'm going to go to products on the opportunity. Let's select a health tablet, one-on-one session, and a bronze subscription. Next, I'll just go through the standard prompts here you go through. So we'll say 1 tablet, and we'll say 6 sessions, and maybe we'll say 1 subscription. And that should pull all the prices from our price book. We'll click save. All right, now I've gone through, I've created my products for my opportunities. So you can see here, everything I input in the previous screen is showing now. I've got 6 one-on-one sessions, 1 home health tablet, 1 bronze subscription. Now I can click through and select my start and end dates. So I might say this client will want to begin his or her services on March 1st, and then end their services and subscription on February 28th, 2021. Now when I click next, I should see a service contract with these line items generate. Just one thing real quick, if you just created products on this opportunity, I just suggest that before you start this, you click refresh tab or refresh your browser. So funny things happen sometimes when you don't do that when you're trying to create data. That's another conversation for another day, but always good to make sure your screen is fresh. Click next. Now, when we go to service contracts, you'll see I've got a service contract starting on March 1st, ending on February 28, 2021. It's in active status as we stated in the flow. I'm going to click into this. Now, when I open this, you'll see here I have 3 contract line items. I have a home health tablet, which is a quantity of 1. I have 6 one-on-one sessions, and I have 1 bronze subscription. So this is a good example of how these things can work and work well. Now I'd like to show you an example of where flows in and of themselves and alone may not be the best tool for the job. So here we've got a little bit more complex version of this use case we talked about before. Same company, same products, but in this case, once we have a closed opportunity, we want to create an asset for something that represents hardware or product in this case. So the home health tablet might be an asset. We also want to create an entitlement based off the entitlement template we have for our product. So if you're not super familiar with Service Cloud, I'd certainly recommend you take a couple of trails down in the entitlement section, because entitlements are fantastic tools, especially for larger companies that offer a lot of benefits to their customers or subscribers for certain things. You can use these to track and limit the number of cases you give to a customer for things you might want to deliver for that entitlement. You can also track all the service you've given for folks under entitlements they have. It's a wonderful tool for service management. So what we'll do is we'll have an asset with an entitlement. If it's a physical product, a piece of hardware like this home health tablet, what we'll do is create a service contract with line items for all of the services that somebody bought. So it's a little bit different. We have effectively a one-to-one relationship between an asset and a hardware product, and we have one-to-many relationship between a service contract and the services we offer, because we're going to lump them into a single service contract with many entitlements. So here we want to say create one service contract for any or all of these services somebody would buy, create related entitlements for these items within the service contract. So you can see here a bit more complex than what we were looking at before. So we go from, as you'll recall in the first simple example, the account, opportunity product, service contract line items. Now we're creating an asset for hardware that has an entitlement relating to it based off the entitlement template relating to the product. And on the flip side of it, for services, we have many services as service contract line items for a service contract with entitlements that can relate either to the service contract or line items, depending upon what your preference is and how you want to set this up for your business process. And these would feed off entitlement templates for the products for these line items. So as we increase the number of objects in the picture, a flow alone becomes much more cumbersome. So I can show you here what this looks like compared to before. This is a much more complex flow. We're in a situation now where we have some serious considerations about how we're working with all these different data sets. And there are some disadvantages. So if we were to rely on a flow alone to manage this process, we can't take advantage of things like SOQL. SOQL, you can query up and down parents, children, grandchildren, and so forth. You're able to pull data from multiple objects in a single query. Here, you have to query each object individually to get the data you want, which is really inefficient, consumes a lot of database calls, and could really cause this thing to fail at scale. You don't have the in operator for when you query data. So if you wanted to get data from multiple records in a list, let's say you had a list of IDs, you want to find all the data for those records in that list, can't do that in a flow, which makes it very difficult. So here we have to do very funky, strange things like use a for loop inside of a for loop to get data for records and evaluate data that meet certain criteria. So it's very cumbersome. In a lot of cases, you have to query all records and then query inside of that through a loop to find the records you really want to work with. Again, the multiple database calls is really of serious consideration when people are using this at scale. You want to try and consolidate that as much as possible. This is horribly difficult and complex to maintain, horribly difficult to troubleshoot. There's a lot of tactics in how you could do this, but it's not simple, it's not straightforward, very difficult to debug, very difficult to test and maintain, lots of potential unintended consequences. So we want to avoid those at all costs. What you can do in situations like this is use a web component or an R component with controllers. So if you wanted to get a little bit more in the realm of, hey, for this given set of products in your opportunity, we found, this entitlement template for this asset. We found these other entitlement templates for these service contract line items. You can give the user a lot more control and flexibility in terms of how they set up entitlements, where they want to set up one entitlement for the service contract, where they want to set up separate entitlements for service contract line items, what templates are available, the web component, the Aura component would be much better for that experience. And the beauty of this too is we can also integrate invocable Apex. So instead of making all these calls to the database to find these entitlement templates for these products, to figure out what to construct, we can just call one method in a class, have all that returned back to us in the flow, and arguably cut out a lot of these orange boxes you see here at the bottom. We can make this as simple as 5 steps by making a single call that returns everything back that we need. Thank you very much for your time today. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of topics. Would certainly encourage you to ask any questions you have. Feel free to contact us through thecoterie.io. Feel free to follow us on Twitter at thecoterie.io. And feel free to reach out to us directly here at the Coterie if we can help you with anything else. But certainly leave your questions and comments here on the page, and always happy to follow up and dive a little deeper if you want. Thank you very much.